We have the background section of the agenda on the existing law. And Ben did a real favor this morning, printed out some copies of the definitions from the universal recycling law. Just as a basis, the universal recycling law amended a bunch of sections of existing statute. And so when you read it, it's a little like a Christmas tree bill. It's got a piece from here, a piece from there. And the three main pieces we're sort of discussing in this background part are the definitions section of statute, which specific definitions is food residuals or food scraps, as we generally layman's terms call it, and then source separation. So those two definitions, and the food residuals management hierarchy, which is another part of statute. Yeah, with that, should I give folks a chance to just read for a second? Why don't we just do that for 5 minutes? Ben, is there a way we can email the participants?
Put it in chat.
Okay. Tom, yeah.
I'm wondering, Ben, if while people are reading this, if it's possible to pull up the subtext from the 10 VSA 6605K, the hierarchy, the language that falls below the list of actions.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll share my screen.
Good point.
Thank you for putting this together. That's very helpful.
So these two first definitions, as folks are reading, were added to statute, the waste management statutes in Title 10. And they're a crux of what this group is going to be diving into. It's part of your charge.
Yeah, I just went and did it. Yep.
All right, looks like most folks here are good. We want some discussion around this, or do we want to go to the broader organics management system?
One question I have in this space while we're talking definitions, is there a definition of a generator?
As far as those statutes are concerned, I don't think there is.
All right.
And for non-solid waste people, generator is the term we've been using for many years. Anybody who generates the waste. But in a lot of different statutes, like I'm thinking of the single-use products law specifically calls out food establishments, which is defined in statute, right? But the universal recycling law didn't create a generator category.
Right. So
it does say any person. There's other parts of statute.
Are haulers generators, even if they don't generate the waste, they just haul it, but there's not a generator? All right. Thank you.
With the phase-in implementation of the statute, it is implicit that generator refers to, at this time, since July 2020, I think what's the final step, that it refers to any person. I don't know how it reads there.
Scroll down.
Yeah. Any person who generates any amount of food residuals is meant with generator.
Thank you for that. It's often person that's referred to.
There's a supporting piece in the definition of source separated. Or food residuals that says at the point of generation.
Point of generation.
Yep.
All right.
So it sort of all works together.
But as those materials are transferred, that doesn't transfer that generator status.
There's also, I mean, it's worth mentioning, there's the landfill ban section of statute where it says food residuals are banned from the landfill. And essentially, there's a whole list of them, and it says no person shall knowingly dispose of. And then there's the 11 landfill ban items, of which food residuals was added to that list. So that is very broad, and that knowing disposal is something subject to a lot of interpretation, discussion. Yeah. Other questions about the definitions or?
But part of
Yeah.
the regnant would be that implicit in that is that the hauler, because we're differentiating between generators and transporters, if they're knowingly carrying that, they would fall under that category, that description.
Well, in terms of the landfill ban?
Yeah.
I think it's, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but I think it's subject to some interpretation what constitutes knowing disposal. I think there's, we've had discussions about, if you, you're taking recyclables and dumping them in the trash, and the person doesn't have recycling and they're not recycling, is the hauler culpable for that? I think there's an argument to be made. I think where we often try and focus our resources is on the generator, because they've been the one dragging their feet and not bothering to separate the recyclables out. So yeah, I think that's all part of it.
I know Barb Schwender from our enforcement group has followed up on complaints. This is years ago now. I don't remember what came of it, but somebody had curbside sort of separate recyclables and trash, and they said that the hauler put them both into one bin, and we did follow up on it. I don't remember the outcome offhand. I could look that up, figure out if there was.
Yeah, we have at least,
But
over the years, a half dozen of those.
yeah, so the
And-
obvious things like that, it's but Josh's point of the knowingly is the difficult thing for us in our offices in Montpelier to decipher.
But we do follow up on, I mean, to your point, yeah, we do pursue the hauler. And
Yeah, no, I just wasn't sure it was
Mingle.
interpreted right now as to where that chain of custody changed. So the other question I had with just definitions in mind is pertinent parts of the statute for other materials that may be included in packaging. So recyclable plastics, for instance. What do we have definitions that we can provide? Not right now, but to the group, or if you have
Sure.
there that might be pertinent to the handling of recyclable materials?
Yeah, we can put up the mandated recyclable definition, which, and I can read it to the group, which means source separated materials, aluminum and steel cans, aluminum foil, aluminum pie plates, glass bottles and jars from food and beverages, and polyethylene, basically PET, plastic bottles and jugs, HDPE plastic bottles and jugs, and corrugated cardboard, white paper, newspaper. There's a whole bunch. Yeah,
And that is
that's also included
Part
in
of it.
landfill bans.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Can we, I guess one of the things in receiving these definitions just structurally, can we start a folder of formal information that the committees received that we can always go back and access or something, and just begin building a portfolio of information?
Yeah, I think we could set it up a couple different ways. We've been doing it on the website, but it's kind of a clunky way to store and organize a lot of documents. We also have access to FTP site where we could share that stuff, because that's easier for people to enter and then share things that way. So there's a couple options that we could do, whatever is the preference of the group is fine by us.
I don't have a preference on the format, just that we have something
Yep.
centralized that we can all access. And I wonder if the language from the recycling chapters could be added to that.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll pull it out, put it on this sheet here, and I'll add the second piece of the 6605K. And then I'll start either on the webpage, the stakeholder group webpage, or start an FTP site.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Other questions about the definitions or discussion or the part of statute, the food recovery hierarchy? I will note, Tom, is a good point that we should add to the document the rest of that 6605K section because it goes on quite a bit. And that's where, Steve, it talks about Caroline was just bringing up, it does mention generator.
Under that
Person-
C5.
Yeah. Been a while since I looked at it, but
Person whose acts or processes produce.
right. Yeah, and person is referred to a couple times in there because there's also the de minimis amount allowance of disposal of food waste if they have a program, if the person has established a program separate. So there's a couple of references to that.
There's no other comments on this, then I would want to highlight that looking at this statutory language, that A&R had drafted in 2019 a policy with the goal to clarify what this means, outlining that it does mean food residuals shall not be mixed with packaged food residuals at the point of generation, and that doing so would not satisfy the source separation requirement and would automatically preclude any materials processed that way being utilized by any higher priority options on the hierarchy, specifically naming food for people or food for animals, meaning basically precluding any agricultural use of materials that have been commingled at the source of generation.
Caroline, are you referring to a draft of the policy?
Yeah,
We can
but
make
since
it.
it was always just clarifying what's the law, I think it's important to recall that that's what the law is.
Well, I'm happy to share, and Tom had asked, I think, for some documents to be shared with the group. There was a draft version of this policy and I'm happy to share that with the group. We even have, I think Ben has some printouts of it if folks want. And then we have the post on the website, the January 2020 version of the policy that was released to the public. That's what we're here to talk about is differences of opinion with regard to how this statute should be walked forward. I mean, that's really what the charge of this group is. And I guess you are charged with analyzing the agency's position. I think the second charge of the group. First one is recommendations on whether the organics management hierarchy should apply to each generator of organic waste. The second charge of the group is whether A&R should modify its existing policies surrounding source separation of organic waste. And I guess, Tom, before we, and I'm only saying Tom because you put the agenda together, before we dive headlong into that, do you want to follow the agenda or have any more discussion or questions about the background? Do you want to go to the scope of the study? What is the feelings of the group?
I mean, I'd say stick with the agenda is my thought on it. If somebody put it together, then I say that's what we stick with.
I think that just to that end, like you've already suggested, Josh, if we have these uploaded into the file and have any of that related background, be it not even if it's the finished thing, but the draft, I really appreciate you guys offering up that. And so the arc of those interpretations to the present would be great.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and on that point, having these two documents in hand, this one's August 2019, and then this one is January 2020. So I'm just trying to understand kind of that timeline.
Sure.
from this document to this one that we got at the
Yeah.
last meeting.
Yeah,
Yeah, you haven't had a chance to read the draft, but I think if you read them both through side by side, it
Makes sense in there. All right, perfect.
yeah, I mean, just briefly, the, the discussion today is, the discussion, the charge of the group is the three things that I was just talking about, but the agency had a lot of discussions in 2019 with the Universal Recycling Stakeholders Group and internally about statute and how to apply it and how it should be interpreted and how it reads and basically how you walk it forward. And that's where that draft comes from, and the resulting version that we put out publicly is the January 2021, but the draft is also one we have in our minds that made publicly available. And we're happy to do so. So yeah, there was a lot of discussion. I think if this was easy, we wouldn't be around this table either in any case, so. Okay. Good. So there's some discussion about organics management system in general. And I will just say, as framing stuff, the role of this group is to look at depackaging, but also with the three charges in mind. The two first ones about the hierarchy and the source separation requirement, and the third one is proper use of depackagers. But there is a broader system, and actually Caroline was kind of mentioning it. There's food donation, there's food waste reduction, there's food donation, there's food for animals, composting, and anaerobic digestion. And all are happening even before the law, and all are happening after the law, in some shape or form. Mike, is there anything else you wanted to dive into there or expand upon? I don't know if I'm doing that justice,
No, it kind of gets back to Tom's point. For me, it's like, we've got to look at the system as a whole. And just because maybe Chittenden County might be a little different than Southern Vermont versus the Northeast Kingdom, right? Like, I think we also don't want to pigeonhole the organics industry for improvements. So there could be something that comes out that says, hey, this packaging compostable, maybe you start taking compostable products again, right? Because technology changes or there's some innovation. So how do we have flexibility in the system too for waste sheds? Because yeah, you can talk about Chittenden County and doing source separated, right? We're already doing that in Chittenden County, but are there other counties where they may be going to just a depack and that's the only hauler and that's the only option that they have in that market? So you're basically gonna pretty much kill the organics industry in certain geographic areas because you're going to regulate it out unless someone else comes in to provide that service need, which could or could not happen if someone's not willing to make the investment, right? So I think those are the things that we need to look at as a group as well, not just, hey, one size fits all. I think that's kind of why we're here right now, is because we try to do it more one size fits all, and it's an evolving industry right now.
Yeah.
That's moving forward.
Forgive me if I'm grabbing the agenda a little bit, and I'll look to Tom for direction. This number 2 is a lot to bite off. It talks about evaluation of depackaging and the hierarchy all in one. And I wonder if we want to take one of the charges and start there, whether it's the hierarchy or source separation or the role of depackaging. But start with one of those and get into some dialogue about it. What are your thoughts? Or if I'm missing something and there's something written here that we want to stick to, please, by all means.
It may be that 2B and C can be incorporated and blended into 3. I think my intent was, picking up from our last meeting, was to create space to, before we get in the weeds of these things, begin sort of like, outlining where the edges of the conversation are and what we need to be like. There's a million questions to ask, but we need to be precise and more discerning in what we're focusing on. And so what are the things that we're trying to, what are the on what basis are we evaluating these things? Because I think we're all starting this conversation knowing that data alone can't answer the question at this point. And like Mike said, part of that is building in some flexibility to adapt to changes in data and technology and whatnot over time. So I think this piece in A, that Mike was just talking about, I think it deserves a little bit more discussion, and just because I think that's part of how we frame everything else. And then maybe B and C get folded into 3.
Well, I take what Mike's talking about as the role of depackaging, which is sort of the third one of the group's charges, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well,
Maybe I can frame it in a different way.
Yeah.
Maybe help more discussion.
Yeah.
Maybe we can just talk about sort of leaving the black and white text aside. Maybe we can talk about what we think a successful organics recycling system looks like.
That's what 3 is to me.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where I was headed.
Oh, we're getting there. with
Yeah, so I think that, and I had a suggestion for a little exercise we
Okay.
could do around
that.
that.
Okay, that works.
So, yeah, maybe we just bump B and C to 3 and we take it on as Ben just described. Does that work for everybody? Just to consolidate it. I was just trying to flesh the details out, but maybe a little too detailed.
Yeah, that works for me.
Works for me.
Okay, so one of the pieces, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when I read your question, Mike, that resonated with me as well, is there are aspects of the questions we're asking that extend beyond depackaging, for instance, and come to, composting facilities, farms, other energy production. And so number 2 is, well, not 1 and 2 of the questions, the hierarchy, and then the question of source separation. I don't think the conversation here is as narrow as one practice like depackaging. I think it is global to the entire organic system, and includes practices like source separation and how they are implemented. Is that part of what you were getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, because when you start tying in the hierarchy too, we're gonna start saying, okay, and we've looked at, feeding animals, right? That's just a perfect example of, and we haven't done it because we've done it in very small subsets, but when you start getting into feeding into animals, you have to have really good protocols and procedures in place so that you don't kill a whole herd of cows. And right, you can start having people start coming into this industry saying, hey, we're just going to feed it all to animals. And then we have an issue down the road because a farm lost, a whole herd of cows. And we've seen it out in the Midwest where they do it pretty successfully, but they're really strict as what they take and what they'll actually process to then send to animal field. So I think that's the thing for me, is we got to look at this holistically. Yes, depackaging is a piece, but if we build a hierarchy that says this is the direction we're going to go, you're going to have the unintended consequences of people pushing it to streams that maybe we don't want it to be in, right? Or we don't want it on the farms because of, the sticks that could break off and hurt livestock, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's been a consistent message that we've heard from the Agency of Agriculture. Conversations over the years are just like the purity and the content of those materials that are coming on farm is a primary concern for sure.
Yeah, I mean, safety of animals and products is going to be paramount. And in those areas, there's little bandwidth to change after something occurs. It's not like, oh yeah, we could scrape that layer of topsoil off or something like that. It's, some of those can be very long lasting changes if it's impacts to land, animals, or food. Those are significant. So yeah.
Just technical comment on the agricultural use. So no food residuals are, unless they're certified as food processing residuals, that are allowed to be fed. But in this context, we're not talking about animal feed, and specifically not animal feed for hogs or cattle, but it's more about allowing specifically poultry access to compost piles of food residuals. And or Tom could fill in more of why that's biologically the way that is practiced. But having food residuals being a feed that can be, like, on the commercial scale, be fed to cattle. I'm not sure if that's recommended for that species of animal in any way. It would be regulated differently than what currently is in Vermont allowed, in terms of allowing access from poultry to those piles. And for hogs specifically, it's illegal to feed them.
Just a point of clarification, I think that though doesn't capture in terms of the hierarchy of the feeding of animals, there is this whole parallel industry for bakery commodity products that is technically part of that food residual stream, and if anything is also underregulated, and we know we're feeding animals plastic, so that might be something actually that we want to pay attention to as we sort of look at the entire system.
Yeah, and I'll just further expand on that. We did have a complaint come in when a pig farm no longer was receiving liquid whey from a dairy processor, so food processing residual, which also can be fed to, we've, for anyone listening in, we have, for working purposes with our conversations with Agency of Ag or anyone else, we sort of have cleaved off food processing residuals as like your homogeneous type of food waste from food manufacturing generally. We're a dairy state. We have a lot of dairy food manufacturing, food processing residual, and then there's food residual. And the definition in statute is food residual, and we sort of lump those all in that category. But when we use our rules, we actually break that out further. So it's like statute, then rules, and people get confused by those terms very easily. But there are examples of food processing residual where the facility that, at least in my conversations with the facility that was previously sending to animal feed and stopped, was because they felt they couldn't guarantee the safety that to the animal health that is required, and so they ceased doing it, which really upset that pig farmer.
And just a quick follow-up while we're on that subject. This part of the law, the agricultural use of food residuals, is now under Agency of Agriculture jurisdiction, and they are held by statute to present rules also next January. So Stephanie Smith has been working on that, and maybe would be interesting to see how the draft rules look like, and it wouldn't preclude this group in any way from making additional recommendations before those rules are being finalized. If that is something of interest to the group, it's in the make.
I guess just to come back to the agenda before we kind of maybe shift towards item 3, the one part of the sort of basis on how we're evaluating these things, I think might be worth doing before we get into sort of more of like a visioning exercise, is just very high level. Like, are we basing our interpretation of depackaging and the hierarchy in part on definitions in statute? Are we evaluating these things based on existing science? You know, what just naming some of those general buckets that we want to be hitting. Not for the purpose of getting into them right now, but just sort of naming them so that as we go through this, we have our own mental checklists for the types of things we're looking for answers around. So, I mean, just to kick that off quickly, I mean, maybe we don't need to separate depackaging and the hierarchy per se, just we could create these general buckets. But I mean, I think like legal interpretation would seem relevant in terms of interpreting the statute.
I think you have the ability to go further than that. Like, you have the ability to make recommendations as to what it should be.
Right.
And that's what I read the first charge to be. Recommendations on whether the organics management hierarchy should apply to each generator. I mean, and it's referring to statute right there. So you're recommending if there's a change or a clarification or. But
I guess I'm trying to identify what are the filters we want to run these things through in order to answer those questions, you know? And yes, that could include a change, a proposed change. Human health and safety, does that seem like a relevant consideration?
It does. I just think the question is, how do you get there, right? How do you, because it's going to be a moving target, right, as well. So how do you not block the system, right? If you're trying to create organics management and you're trying to move it forward, how do you, like, what level, right? Like, and I think, and not to say that like anytime you dilute something, right, it still pollution, right? But how do you say, hey, is it better to go to a landfill or is it better to go to a depack facility, right? Like, how do you balance those things as well?
Yeah, no, that's why I think that these filters sort of help us try to tease out the information points to sort of do that triangulation.
Yeah, I mean, health and safety, obviously, and protection of the environment. I mean, I think everyone in this room would agree with those things.
Logical.
But the devils are always in the details, right? Like that's not also stop an industry from progressing forward.
Well, I think we're gonna be finding ourselves in these juxtapositions, and then I think we have to ask, is industry innovation more important in this moment over whatever the potential risk might be or whatever. So right now I have statute, health and safety, ecological protection. Are there any other sort of major filters that we want to make sure that we're considering?
When I look at this management hierarchy, I see kind of 1 through 3 in some ways are still using that food somewhat in its current form. And I do think it's important to acknowledge the resources that have gone into producing that, and if it can be utilized in that form. Once you get down to 4 and 5, that food as it was produced is not being utilized. It's changing form, whether it's through compost, through digestion, through energy recovery. So there's that shift. And I mean, everybody in physics, when you have a change in form, there's a loss of energy of some sort.
Efficiency, would that be like caloric efficiency?
Yeah, I guess maybe you could break it down to that, but just recognizing that kind of distinction in that list. And just, I guess, I think in terms of the consumption of those resources and conservation of them.
Resource value.
What's that?
Resource value
Or impacts, something like that.
Market development or something?
It'd almost be a little different than that. It's more, there's a difference between someone eating a piece of food and them using that energy versus that piece of food going into a digester and creating energy. And
I would just, go ahead, Ben.
I was gonna say, it's sort of what the hierarchy is trying to get at, right? The optimal use of these resources and reuse and stuff.
And if I'm just regurgitating stuff that you guys sat through for like
No,
years and
no,
years
no.
and years, and you're like, okay.
I think it's structured that way to say, here's what we think is the priority use for the resources as available, and then it kind of goes down through. So I think it's kind of baked in, but I think it's an important thing to mention out loud, because we just say statute, but saying, optimal resource management or reuse is probably a better way to phrase that. So I appreciate that point.
Yeah, and so where I think that all kind of goes back to evaluating the application of the hierarchy is, if we have kind of a potential cons, what are some of the negative outcomes? What are some of the potential positive outcomes of some of these activities, and evaluating those as well.
Yeah, it's almost like making a tiered structure after that. Here's the main bullet and then,
Yes, no, yes, no.
but there's other things, right? Like transportation impacts on the hauling side, right? Like at what point does that carbon burn to, where are those calculations of, hey, how far should you go? Should you go out to the middle of Ripton to pick up one organic customer, right? Like, there's got to be some of that balance as well. Like, not saying that maybe you'll build the density as the route grows, but that's another piece for us, right? The transportation carbon burn.
Yeah, there is inherently a resource piece.
Yeah.
Built into all of this.
Yeah, life cycle.
Yeah.
One thing on what you're saying, and I think we'll get into this when we get into the details, so I don't want to take away from Tom's filtering, is a lot of what you're getting at with the value of the initial use of the material. This happens in our home lives too. When you buy the apple and you intend to eat the apple, and then the apple goes and goes and goes to the point where it's really mealy and no one wants to eat it. And I'm always the guy in my household who's trying to eat it, suffering through it, and my wife and my daughter won't do it. But I'm pointing. I think this is actually.
On record now.
Yeah, I'm the guy who eats all the garbage. But what you're pointing out is the difficult. A lot of generators get into that situation, and find themselves with stuff that's close to spoilage, and then how suitable is it for animal feed comes up. And I'm not saying that I'm not the expert on that at all, and there's others that are outside this room that are experts on it. There's a lot of debate around that, discussion on that, and that's where, as Ben was bringing up, the deleterious and we've talked, we've been in discussions before about commercial feed law that Agency of Ag has. So, those types of things start to get stirred up in the mix. Some of what you were saying is hitting on those for me. Anyway, back to you, Tom. Sorry.
Yeah, I added Mike's note on transportation. I don't know, is that an adequate category? And you got,
Well, I tempted, it may not be helpful, but, or maybe a tricky one to address, but practicality comes up when Josh is talking about these things. And it's tricky because everybody's going to judge it differently, I think, but Vermont is different than other places for a lot of reasons. One of them is transportation and densities. But the urgency around some of this decision-making seems like important to me, because if there, in lots of scenarios, something may be ideal for animal feed up to a point, and then how do you make that judgment? So I don't know how you would use that as a filter necessarily, but it's an important thing to consider, that what may work on a Tuesday at 3 p.m. might not work Wednesday morning. And so somehow there's got to be determinations made. Not that that's what we're trying to decide, but just remembering that Vermont is tricky in February. What may work in July in Boston may not work in Vermont in February.
Or an emergency situation. I mean, I think that's the other piece that we deal with all the time, right? The 11 o'clock phone call on a Saturday night, and they've got a health risk because they've got spoiling food sitting on the parking lot floor. We've got to be able to move that material. Like they can't do anything. If they have a cooler go out or a freezer go out, like it's got to happen quickly. It can't wait till Tuesday, right, or Wednesday. It's got to be, we're usually there the next day. So how do you build in some of that?
At the same time, I want to make sure that I'm recognizing that, but not leaning on it as an excuse, because I think that's really easy to do as well. It's like, well, we wait a few more hours, then it'll be this next category, or,
I don't think our job right now is to pass judgment on exactly how to do these things as much as just naming. So I just wrote down practicality and logistical considerations.
Yeah.
Would you have any ideas about what those buckets should be?
No, I think pretty good conversation. My concern is just getting through all of it within the timeline that we have been given.
Well, I think we don't have to be totally comprehensive right now. We can always revisit some of these, but I thought it would just be good to have that.
Can you run through that list?
Yeah,
quickly,
and I
just
think
to scribble
Ben will
down?
capture in the notes too, but here's what I have. So I have interpreting statute, which I then made two sub notes on. One is the URL, and then one is other laws. And within the URL, I think making sure that we're not just looking at organics, but also considering the other relevant streams like other recyclables. Item 2 would be health and safety, human health and safety. Item 3 was ecological protection or integrity. Item 4 was resource value and impacts highest and best use. That was the item I was trying to capture that you were speaking to. 5 was transportation. And then 6 was practicality and logistical considerations.
I don't know. I mean, Mike, you can weigh in on this. I feel like that transportation piece is kind of captured in the resource value. I don't know that it needs to be kind of a distinct.
Okay, we can just call it out as a sub.
Yeah, and that's kind of when I was saying the transportation, I felt
Part of it.
part of it. It's almost like practicality and logistics kind of gets back into the freezer goes down at midnight emergency situations. How do you define those? Like,
Yeah.
kind of like breaking it down into subsets.
Yep.
I mean, I feel like that's a pretty comprehensive list to evaluate the hierarchy on.
I have a question or clarification. I think maybe Mike had mentioned this in the transportation, when he was talking about transportation, but in terms of like climate and greenhouse gas emissions, I feel like it's sort of related to the ecological protection, sort of related to the transportation and logistics. But I didn't know if that necessitates being called out more specifically.
I guess I was also thinking that would fall under the sort of ecological integrity protection part. Does having that baked into those feel adequate, or does that not quite capture the priority you want to see on it?
As long as, I mean, if someone said ecological protection, my mind immediately goes to like land and water, not necessarily global climate change. But if we're discussing and we're saying, yeah, that would be included, then that's fine with me.
And maybe for the group, like having kind of a subset of what each of those mean, kind of getting back to the point of you have the overarching bucket that these things, transportation falls into. I mean, I can see it falling into resource value or even practicality and logistics, right? Transportation is going to fall into kind of both of those buckets, right? If you're going to have to ship the stuff to the Midwest, then the practicality and logistics might play into it, where each one of those buckets that we have will have their own piece of practicality, and transportation could probably fit into every one of them. There's going to be the environmental impact of burning carbon. There's going to be the practicality from a logistical standpoint. So, or is that too much to take on?
I think it folds into those just fine. Yeah. We may not have perfect ways of doing it, but
yeah.
I'm not trying to short circuit the discussion. I just want to point out the time. We're about 10 minutes over on this second item, so I don't know if we're some more to discuss here. If we want to move on, just point it out.
let's move on.
Yeah.
So it's okay to jump in on 3
Yeah.
just to explain sort of what I was thinking that what this would look like. You know, I think because we know at the outset we will have subjective sort of decisions to make in the absence of complete data. I think it's just useful to take a second to like figure out how to decouple from the specifics and think about the totality of the system and what success ultimately looks like. And so, you know, one exercise that I thought maybe the group could do right now is to just take 5 minutes to do a retrospective assessment of the system we want to create. So, you know, 20 years from now, what does that system look like? What were the things that we did now in this present moment to create the conditions for success? And what were the things that we didn't do? So what would be an outcome that in 20 years we would feel proud of?
I'll jump in and say that we've achieved, we've gotten to the point where food is not wasted per se, and that what we're calling food waste is really edible stuff. I think 20 years is a pretty good time frame for trying to achieve that. And that we are utilizing the remaining, you know, the food residuals to their highest and best use, and ensuring that we're maximizing that. We've got the UVM studies will be long behind us at that point. We'll know all that data, and we'll be able to make sure that we're ensuring both healthy soils in our state, building resiliency in our agricultural soils, and making sure they have their full ecological function while also obtaining, not maximizing the processes that use these organics for energy consumption where appropriate per whatever we come up with. But I see a space for all of it. I think animal feeding and composting and energy capture are all important. And I think that we've got a long way to go to do better by all of them. And as long as we stick to our, whatever we come up with for whatever's most important, once we have more data, for instance, that we can achieve all those things, hopefully. I also would throw in there that hopefully we're not exporting large quantities of nutrients and organics.
Can you try flipping that around and saying the version of that you would be proud of or that would feel successful?
We are, that as Vermonters, as a state, that we figured out how to fully utilize or do a nutrient balance so that we're not exporting excess nutrients that might benefit our ecosystem. And that one's tough because that'd be ideal, but 20 years is a long time.
Would it be fair to say Vermont retains the resource value for local benefit?
Yeah, that'd be great.
What are achievements that we'd be proud of?
What are you thinking, Mike?
I'm just thinking with a composter's hat on, right? So if I were a composter and you could make a really good product and there's not enough demand in the state of Vermont for your product because we do have fertile lands, are you going to take advantage of somewhere else that may feed that product, right? Because it's going to be market driven, right? So yes, it's great to say that we want to keep it all in Vermont. Do we need it all, right? We're a small state. And that's the thing that I look at, saying, okay, hey, if there's, Massachusetts or New York, are you going to end up selling compost to those places, or do you sell stuff to other farms, right? So it's not going to stay all in Vermont once you produce that final product. I mean, supply and demand is the imbalance, right?
Yeah, I guess maybe the distinction for me is on the resource level rather than the final product.
Yeah.
A little bit different there, and it's really hard to, even in 20 years from now, probably to control the importation of nutrients, for instance. But phosphorus is a good example where we're probably bringing in more than we need statewide. So yeah, I would think that would be part of the balance part where there still have to be allowances for.
Also didn't hear you say that we wouldn't export anything, but that local needs would be met, which to me, like when we sell eggs, we basically try to saturate outward. Doesn't mean that we don't sell into Boston, but we would prioritize Hardwick. And I think that they're not necessarily exclusive. It's just like a priority of benefit.
Yeah, no, I see that too, but I'm more looking at just strictly supply and demand.
Yeah.
Does Vermont have enough demand to keep up? Let's say we become the compost state of the country and we're importing food waste from everywhere, right? Like, and making good products, then you're probably gonna have a supply and demand inverse, which then you'd have to find other markets to sell your product.
What would you be proud of, Jenna?
A lot of it was captured and I don't know your name down the end of the table. I tend to agree with what Mike was saying about the supply and demand and not wanting to necessarily limit to the state boundaries on how we're, dealing with food residuals.
I think just for the sake of the exercise and the time, just to guide it, let's just stay focused on the things that we would be proud of.
I guess I don't have anything to add right at this moment.
I mean, I'd be proud if we take our time and do it right. I think that's the other thing that I think sometimes we get in these positions where we rush ourselves and we rush into decisions. because we think it's the right thing. And we have to, especially on my side, we're dealing with a lot of the unintended consequences of that rush and that need that's out there. So how do we thoughtfully and methodically go through this process so that we do make the right decisions? Because there are going to be big investments by many companies to say, hey, what's the right technology? And once you pick one of those technologies, and once you start investing in those things, it's hard to turn back, right? Because you've built a system. I mean, and you set up your system a certain way. So I think that's another thing, that even having the state and everyone on board saying, hey, we're going to do this methodically, and we're going to do it slowly, and we're going to do it the right way. We're going to do it the Vermont way. There's going to be a lot of discussion and inputs, and we're going to try to think locally. And I think that's a big takeaway for me, because 20 years from now, I mean, this whole industry will change, right? I mean, we've seen it, and I know Dan knows about it in the recycling industry, like the different materials and how that whole system has evolved, right?
I'm going to call that a condition for success. I guess one thing I would add is I feel like we would look around us and feel like we've created a culture of resource stewardship that broadly we're not compelling people to source separate materials for their highest and best use, but that it's a value we share, and a value that we uphold, and a value that we pride ourselves on as a state and as a community.
I think in 20 years, in terms of what I could be proud of, I think I come to this from a kind of number of different places. One would be just not having impacts to agricultural lands or products or crops based on waste management. So finding a good balance in there. So there was no bad scenarios that had occurred and lasting impacts. I certainly, to Dan's point, would support that, just kind of a better nutrient balance. What's coming in, what's going out, and I could see where it would be good to have it be flexible, but just making sure there is that good balance of whatever's being used in the state is being met, and if more of it is exported for good use, I think that could be one way to approach it. I think maybe trying to balance within the state could also be a good goal to pursue.
What would be the thing that we would look to with pride that would ensure no bad scenarios?
Just making sure that contaminants aren't being put onto farms. And yeah, having impacts on products and livestock, as Mike kind of discussed earlier. And the last one I would say is just if there was a better understanding in terms of the lifespan of products. And I think sometimes there's a lot of thoughts in the area about plastics and lifespan of products, but I don't know that same thought goes into organics. And it may need to make sure there's kind of a path for those organics to follow. It's a different path, but kind of the same thinking, I believe.
Other things that we'll be thinking about?
Just to add on that note, just to again phrase that also more positively, that 20 years from now we can be proud of having closed nutrient loops in the state of Vermont, successfully generating highly valuable soil amendments that allow local farms, produce farms, other farms to bring back the nutrients they were giving out locally and regionally to feed Vermonters and beyond, and replenish those nutrients in their grounds and even build soil.
And to Jenna's point earlier, would you sort of include in that like carbon as like
Right.
as an aspect of that, like balanced carbon?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe this is a good time for just to invite folks who aren't at the table to just provide input. I don't know, are there any folks that are listening in that have thoughts about what feel like would be proud of or want to be proud of? I wonder if it would be, or I think I would be proud too of seeing that this system provide the greatest economic benefit to the greatest number of Vermonters.
Food waste recovery system at large, you mean?
Or the version of that system that has no food waste as you're describing. Or we could say economic and resource value because, well, edible food is an economic value of be in dollars and cents in that capacity.
Yeah, I think I would look back in 20 years and be really proud if we were able to construct a resilient system where, you know, things can go one way one day, another way another day, but there's the structure in place where the businesses and the receiving locations, you know, all win.
What kind of businesses are you looking for?
Alexa. And that can, that resilient system to me can be broadened and just say, you know, it'd be a win and a success if it was successful in offsetting imported fertilizers and things that are being purchased and brought in use for farming products that Vermonters eat, and using the stuff that's already here. That lends to resiliency. Having small haulers, medium haulers, large haulers, all, you know, doing the same work, maybe in different regions, maybe overlapping to a degree, but the resilience is there. I think that's a big success to me in 20 years.
Okay. And again, we can keep adding to this. Oh, Natasha, go for
I
it.
just wanted to jump in and build on a lot of what's already been said, but I do think part of that resiliency and part of the common benefit, I think it would be great in 20 years if we had significantly more community composting and smaller scale composting in a decentralized way. I don't know exactly how to fold that in, but you know, organics is one of the things that can really be managed at a lot of different scales. And so I think success would be having robust representation from all of those scales. It's a little different. I know we're talking today more about, you know, sort of large scale or, you know, the volumes that we need to be managing, but I don't want to lose the concept or the thread of having this really be something that everybody in Vermont could get involved in.
Any other things that we want to be proud of? And then we can move on to just things that we would not want in that system. Okay. What would be disappointing, horrifying, saddening, embarrassing?
Not having the ability to move material.
Inadequate infrastructure.
Inadequate infrastructure. And I think that gets back to obviously the local smaller scale compost facilities and competition and end market development, right? Because we deal with that. We've seen that throughout the years with, you know, market is not a market if you only have one offer, right? Like maybe multiple markets. So
We'd say a backtracking to the point where large quantities of food waste end up being landfilled and producing methane, as I think is a potential if things go poorly, if we don't achieve some of these things. And for instance, in Colorado, they've just made some big changes in some of the more progressive areas where they had been diverting a lot of food waste, where they're diverting less food waste because of the complications of it. So that would be unfortunate on a lot of levels.
Similar to that track, thinking about whether for businesses, like I would hope that compost isn't the most expensive and therefore at least the most desirable way to send food residuals away.
I would be embarrassed if we left a legacy of toxins and pollutants, especially those that we don't, that are irreversible or practical. Thing that I would be proud of, actually, just with that in mind, that helps for my thought. I would be proud if we had a comprehensive and integrated enough system that we were, having more conversations about manufacturer liability, packaging itself, some of these upstream issues that we have. I would be proud if we had the forethought and the gumption to, tackle this in its totality.
For me, in 20 years, an unacceptable outcome would be impacts to agriculture, whether it's contaminated food products, contaminated lands, or contaminated animals. And then I also think just that nutrient balance being wildly out of whack of we would have nutrients in state that weren't utilized.
Or that we're putting in the lake.
Yeah.
That are ending up in the wrong place.
Yeah. Whatever fashion they're not being utilized in. Or being put into anaerobic environments underground.
What else don't you want in your obituary?
Oh, I got a whole lot of stuff.
Pertaining to the scope of the.
Thank you.
I think we called Apple.
Can I jump in? This is Natasha.
Yeah.
I'd be really, I guess one thing that's unacceptable to me is if we shifted the burden of poorly managed organics in an environmentally unjust way. So if we were either exporting them or concentrating them in vulnerable areas or among vulnerable populations.
I guess to that, I would be embarrassed if we, given a lot of things that have already been said, lost edible food that could be used to help solve food security issues to non-human consumption. And I'm going to add that as a thing I'd be proud of if we were to able to maximize that opportunity for.
Are we doing on time for this section?
I think we could probably wrap this up too. Should we just move on?
Yep.
Was that a preface to 3 or we're still in 3? Is that right?
We're in 3. I think that kind of frames it, and it resolves like a number of the items there. I think the question then is sort of like, to reach that goal, what are some of the things that we feel like this report needs to accomplish to sort of address some of these things? Is it just simply working towards our ambitions and eliminating our embarrassing outcomes? Is there a way that we can help provide guidance that helps the state kind of discern as to which of those paths it's on?
I think one of the big things is looking at the organics management as a system, a whole system, not just Depac's role in this larger system, right? I think that's the thing for me that I tried to make clear to the legislature was it's not just about Depac versus composting facilities, right? Like there's a whole system that needs to be looked at, and what are the rules? There's some composters that do a really great job. There's some composters that don't do a great job. Some depackers that probably do a really great job. There's some that probably don't do that great of a job. So how do we have clear rules and guidance for all these materials that we're going to be moving so that we, whatever we agree to in this group, like we've kind of got a good outlay of, hey, these are our goals for 20 years from now. How do we now kind of get into the meat of, hey, these are the things that we should allow, or these are the things that we shouldn't allow. That'd be my big thing for the legislature, because there's places we won't send recyclables because we know there's unintended consequences. There's places we won't send organics because we know there are unintended consequences. So how do we actually cement that? Because we're not the police, you're not the police, right? How do we have a good set of rules that then the state can go back and say, we're going to do enforcement?
As we try to make sure that we stay on the path of pride and not the path to embarrassment, when we don't have clear information, for instance, I think some of the information gathering the state's embarking on now is expected to really take 3+ years to give us feedback. So how can we along the way discern as a state? How can A&R discern? How can policymakers discern which path we're on when we don't have a clear view of the total picture?
I think representing the information that is out there now and making it clear that that's not the full scope, but trying to collect that information that does exist currently and kind of lay out some of where that could go, so that in time, some of, thresholds and things could be established, so there could be clear guidance on materials. And, to Mike's point, making it plain that the establishment of those thresholds and that clear guidance would be helpful.
And in the interim, what do you do?
I think, like I said, you just have to clearly identify the information that exists now and try and kind of set up that path forward and get some of those decisions to be made and navigated. I think it's to make the decisions now with incomplete information is not necessarily a better outcome.
So if something is
Excuse me.
established to have potential correlation to, say, some of the things we'd be embarrassed about, like human health effects, but the data sets are incomplete, if you wait, you set yourself on a path already for the data set. You have to pick along the way when you don't, you can say, yes, so once we get this data in, we'll regulate from that basis. But in those intervening years, we need ways of looking at points on the constellation and making connections.
Yeah. And I think there just needs to be somewhat of a risk equation in there is the potential of that embarrassing outcome occurring versus the other outcomes and weighing those and then making some decisions based on that incomplete information. I mean, I think that's kind of the best you can do in that space and trying to share with people what information exists and then what questions exist, as opposed to trying to answer some of those questions. Letting other people know it may be their responsibility to answer those questions is another potential.
Doesn't that go back to Mike's comment about setting some rules or some parameters? You know, so if we're on this road, we clearly don't want to veer in the wrong direction, right? So let's set some parameters maybe on one side to keep us going in the right direction and then have timelines to reevaluate that. You know, so it's not just a free for all, right? We're not saying don't do anything to make progress, but let's set some parameters that can help us get the other information that we.
And what do we need in order to set those parameters, like in this legislative session versus in 5 years when we have more data?
That's a great question that maybe the processors or the people that are, I think that's where we need to hear from stakeholders, right? Like, how can we set parameters that everyone can live with in order to get us to the ideal system? So those are questions for potential witnesses.
I think the inclusion of her comment about timelines is always helpful too. So putting some timelines in there and encouraging some of that work to be done by a set date. We think it's appropriate that there's dates that the work could be done by.
I think it's worth sort of noting as we think about this, because this informs a lot of the way I think about it, but you know, we're all kind of getting smart to PFAS in the last 5 years, but between the manufacturers and then eventually the EPA, there's been 50 years of knowledge of potential harm. So I guess one of the questions I have is, how do we, that to me, that's an embarrassing outcome. The fact that we're shutting farms down right now, the fact that we've polluted soils with chemicals we don't know how to pull out and don't anticipate knowing how to pull out, the fact that we may have caused people who are alive now and in the past irreversible harm. Those are embarrassing outcomes. So in this moment, I feel embarrassed about where we are collectively. And I wonder, just for the sake of exercises like this, if we just look at some of these existing scenarios that we're dealing with, and we look retroactively and we say, what happened? Why was, when the EPA became aware of these things in the late 80s and early 90s, why didn't we take other measures to prevent this? In fact, we started using PFAS even more and allowing them to get spread on farmland and have these irreversible things. So we're already on the path to embarrassment. I think as a group, it would be helpful for us to really be thoughtful about not only sort of ideas about how to mitigate it, but looking backwards, how could we have mitigated some of the things that we're facing today? You know, microplastic pollution is not a new topic. It was being talked about in the 90s. Climate change started getting talked about in the 70s. Here we are 50 years later. So I think that there's a systemic analysis I have that says we have not been doing it right. And part of the question I'm asking myself is, how do we correct that? You know?
Tom, I just wanted to point out one point of clarification in what you were saying. I think you sort of implied that all manufacturers knew about PFAS use in their products and packaging. My understanding is I don't think that's the case necessarily. Some of the larger manufacturers that are including those ingredients initially certainly knew. But what we're finding is some of this stuff is just recycled in some of the streams.
Sure.
So it can come in as paper pulp fiber that's recycled. Recycling is a good thing, right?
Absolutely.
So
No, I meant
just for the record, I don't want it to be implied that all manufacturers are implicit in this.
No, the manufacturers of origin. Yes, absolutely. So anyway, I'm just saying that so that we can like be really thoughtful about like, we actually already are finding ourselves in that embarrassing situation. The question is, how do we change the path, I think? What would we need to do differently to have arrived today and look back 20 years ago to say, wow, we killed it. We did totally the right thing.
I think that's a good question, but we also need to be realistic that we don't know what is toxic, right? We don't, like, there are things that are toxic to us right now that we aren't aware of, right? So we don't know what we don't know. And I think there's value in saying, why did you do this? Why didn't you communicate to us? But not dwelling on that, like how can we create the perfect system and let's move backward? Like, let's get us to that ideal system and work backward to figure out how we can get to that. Take the steps. But
I think that's what we're trying to do. That's sort of the purpose of the exercise in my mind. I think the thing is we did have, just like we have now with some of these things, correlatory information, but not conclusive information. And we opted to wait, say, for conclusive information, or we just turned a blind eye. There was a moment where we had some information, and that's what the situation we now find ourselves in. And so what would be the difference of approach that would lead to a more safe outcome that doesn't like occurring and saying, wait till we know? It's inevitable that we are making a choice. We're not deferring choice. We're making a choice to stick with the potential risk.
So then do you say organics management of the state of Vermont is off the table 100%? So we, like, all organics, the bans, everything else is off the table to let the industry play out, right? Is that?
No, I don't think, I mean, I think we don't have any reason to believe right now that a tote full of lettuce alone is potentially creating adverse risk that didn't exist already. But there are other materials that we could look at that say that, yeah, that risk is higher over here. So I don't think it's about just throwing our hands up and saying, oh, we can't do anything. I think it's about being discerning and trying to determine where that risk is, and then what do we do with that assessment of risk.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily like wanting to take something to an extreme and say, well, we just got to scrap the whole thing while we figure stuff out. I think it's important, as we've all said, that one of the most important things is human health and environment, right? So sort of agreeing where that line could be, I think is part of what we're trying to do as part of this exercise. One of the things that we've sort of identified internally is, well, a voluntary effort that it's not voluntary, it's our job, but an effort that we want to do is really pushing clean source separation. And this might be a little bit outside the scope of this group, but it's just an area where we're saying maybe a renewed effort to generators and haulers and facilities alike of like, what's the expectation for all these entities along the way, just to clean up source separation in the absence of some of the data that we need to determine what the impacts are at the endpoints. We can just say, it's safe to say that a cleaner waste stream is not going to harm, right? So that's kind of what we're approaching. And there's a clean compost, I don't know what it was finally called, marketing campaign launching nowish. So like that's something that we're doing and working with facilities and haulers and even food residual drop-off locations to come up with what their policies are for screening food scraps to make sure that it's clean at that first checkpoint. And then giving our number. If the generator is a problem and continues to be a chronic violator and doesn't source separate adequately, here's the state's number and we'll call them up and follow up. So that's something that we've identified as where we can improve in the absence of data. Just do the best that 20 years back. I don't think we'll regret that.
One point I did want to point out, Tom, is that, and I'm not a national expert on PFAS by any stretch, but the majority of situations I'm aware of as far as PFAS in agriculture on a national level do not involve food residuals and are not tied to that type of waste management activity.
Yeah, yeah,
What's that?
it's just for a lack of testing at this point. But I mean, sludges, it's a parallel story. So we had these concerns in the 90s even. Regulators sort of decided not to look at it, and now it's catching up with us. Human manure is not a it's not a pollutant. It's
Yeah.
everything we add to the sludge that becomes the pollutant. And so it's the same thing with food scraps. Food scraps are great.
Well, it depends what you define as a pollutant. There's many people who will say human manure and human waste have pollutants in them, and they'll argue that quite vehemently at the table. For group process, Tom, and
Yeah.
for the group, how do you take this vision and move it into your process to get to item 4, like digging into what your charge is?
Right.
And you can keep going on this. I just want to like bring that back up because you've got some progress here. I just want to see where
I think we should move on from it. I think one of us maybe should offer to draft something that the rest of the group can sort of read, look back on and say, yeah, that's kind of the framework we're working from as a group. That seemed like a good way to move.
certainly you can start that and you can come back to it next meeting when you have something written.
Yeah. Anybody want to volunteer to?
The question I missed it, sorry.
One of us just sort of drafting a summary of.
Yeah, you
I can
took.
get it all in a minute,
Yeah.
so I can just share that and then you can do like verbatim, which is painful sometimes, but it might be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can certainly create a draft if that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And get some of your notes as well, Tom.
So given that we do, and I, sorry if I'm driving this hard, but we are tight on time and I just want to respect that. Just to do a little triage here. Maybe we should take item 5 and just think a little bit about how we want to organize the next 3 meetings and then how we want to go about clarifying our questions and who we're going to invite in. And just frame this a little bit, like, what, do we want to take this question by question? Do we just want to have a free for all and everybody just start inviting whoever they want?
We're happy to bring people in for you. Invite people, try and coordinate that.
I mean, I'd be interested in seeing from other states. I mean, if Colorado's pulling back on organics as a whole, why? What are their concerns? I know there's other entities that we work with saying, these are unique issues to just us. So where states have been doing it longer, maybe.
Is one of, so really quickly before we jump into the what, maybe that's what we should do right now is jump into the what. I guess I'm trying to give us a little structure to just figure that out in right now.
I think a structure would be helpful. I mean, there's 3 really big questions and whether we're tackling them all at once, that seems messy, but time, I don't have much of it. So I don't know what the best path is, but I think structure would help. And there will be overlap, like if we bring people in to talk about any one of these specific things, it'll probably apply to at least a couple of the questions, the specific questions that we've been asked to answer. Anyway, I would be in favor of some structure around how we, number 4.
Tom, what if we do if for A, which is the hierarchy, is there anyone you want to hear from or any data you want around that topic of that?
Yeah, we can just jump through these. Yeah, I mean.
I'm throwing that out there.
Okay, should we just tackle these, the 3 questions then and identify sort of the things we want to know about and talk about and what we want? Okay, so coming back to your suggestion, Mike, which of those 3, I don't personally need to go in order. If things come up, we can just figure out which of these buckets they fit in.
I think other states that are dealing with some of these things would be number 1, right? That's kind of what I was going off of. That first question, recommendations on what the organics management hierarchy apply to generated organic waste.
I don't think any other state has a hierarchy.
But can you gain perspective as to what's
states are doing.
what states are doing.
Yeah, there are some, I mean, there are some states that have, like New York with a
New York
priority
has-
for donation, and California has priority for donation.
Washington. I don't remember the name of it.
Washington has the newest, one of the newest laws to
All right,
come.
well, I mean, I guess the point is I'm wrong, so let's find out.
I don't know
what
how,
states are
I don't know
doing.
if it's exactly hierarchy. There's emphasis on food rescue in, heavy emphasis, I would say, in the New York law and the California law.
Well,
And I think Washington might.
Okay, we are tasked with the hierarchy though, so not that these are practices they're deploying, but that they have something that is definitive that says here is the way we want to do it and how we want to prioritize that. Does that exist? So I think that's the question we're being asked is specific to this.
Most states do have a hierarchy. And I would say that the trickiest part is the AD and compost line. You know, that kind of flips
Right.
back and forth. But besides that, most of it is pretty similar.
Have a waste hierarchy of some kind,
Yeah,
right?
a food recovery hierarchy of some kind.
Yeah.
Maine does, you do.
That says like it is the policy of the state versus here's what we suggest. Like I know a lot of people point to the EPA hierarchy, but it's
That's
a different
totally
style
different.
hierarchy than this.
Tell
Yeah.
you what, we'll look into that offline.
Okay,
We'll
great.
do some state research. And
So how are other
we may have
states?
already done it. We might have already. We can look into that.
Does that also, Mike, apply to B, or two rather, the SSO? And it probably goes without saying, but since you weren't with us last time, Christine, what's that?
I listen.
Oh, you did. Okay. But just like, I mean, you have a unique view here and I think we're all very interested in hearing. So if there are specific questions to these things that EPA is interested in, it would be good to capture them here. I think it would be, in order to answer the question itself, I think we need some legal interpretation of what is in statute.
Want that from government, or do you want that?
I mean, I have actually a list of folks that I was going to hand to you guys, but yeah, I think it would be great to have Matt come in. I think also Peter Blair from would also be an independent lawyer that would be that's looked at this quite a bit.
There's a comment in chat from Peter now saying, New York's food waste management law doesn't have a food waste hierarchy per se. Instead, the law requires that all quote designated food scrap generators shall separate their excess food donation for human consumption to the maximum extent practicable. Thanks, Peter.
No problem. And to Tom's point, I'm happy to give some legal analysis of Vermont statute itself. Plus, I'm pretty familiar with New York's, Connecticut's regulations, Massachusetts regulations, and a couple others.
For free?
Yes, for free.
Just kidding.
Folks, people want to invite, or
We'll get off the legal thing. Tom, can you share that list with the group that you had? You said you had some suggestions for legal entities.
Oh, I was just making a general statement for each of these things. I already have a whole list that
Okay.
I'm ready to give you. I don't want to like burn the entire.
I was
group
just gonna
with
say, at
this.
some point, can you transfer that over?
Yeah, no, I'll send you. It's in Excel if that's telling.
Like the.
I guess there, I think implicit in this is a question of, are there scenarios under which exemptions or the hierarchy don't apply? Where exemptions apply or the hierarchy, you know, when it says whether it should apply to each generator of waste, you know, I'm trying to break that down to what that really means. What are we sort of evaluating that on besides a legal interpretation?
Did we just determine what a generator is? Like, are there categories of generators, whether it's like a residential home, like a restaurant, a food manufacturer? Are there different categories of generators?
Yeah, Jenna, I mean, there definitely is in terms of how we talk about the logistics of serving different generators or getting services or options for different generators, and also the waste products of different generators. But I'd say loosely in the solid waste industry, generator, yeah, there are different types, and that generator is a broad term for anyone that makes waste. And in statute, you often see any person who generates, and person is broad in the most, broadest of terms. Could be a company.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
But in current statute, it's not specific about a
Right.
specific generator. They're all.
Right, they're all one. So there isn't a lot of language in statute about supermarkets must do this, schools must do that. With some exceptions in the universal recycling law, it called out public buildings and spaces with regard to dual, basically having a recycling bin next to every trash can, and that is defined. And so like a library that's town owned would be a public, so that one does have parameters around it. Yeah, is that helpful, Jenna? A little vague?
Yeah. Question, but because the hierarchy is in the statute, is that it's like legally binding that you have to go through, you know, reduction, diversion to food consumption by humans? You have to go through that and either deem it not possible in order to get to the next level for no matter who you are. Like,
That's what this group is. That's what this group is going to be discussing. Essentially, it's been asked by and this is where Tom is trying to figure out what's in that one line too. And I think all of us are. What is their intent there? But the state has, the agency has taken the reading of statute to be an encouraged directive to generators writ large, from the homeowner to the business to the restaurant, with their food or food material or food waste that they no longer have a use for. Others have advocated that it actually be a requirement that exactly as you just gave the example. It's not the way that we have implemented things to date, that it's a requirement, but there has been debate about that. I didn't, feel free to chime in, other folks.
Yeah, I read their question to actually make the implicit assumption that it is a requirement. If you read it, it says, you know, should it apply? And in the definition, it says it is the policy, and then it prescribes. So I think that implicit in this is the assumption that yes, it is a requirement. The question is on who and under what circumstance should it apply to. So to me, it's a focus on should it apply to every generator, or might there be some exceptions?
So it's all you all to discuss.
That's a really big question that we might struggle with, but I'm wondering if like, I'm guessing we could come to some agreement on what the exemptions would be if that scenario were true. Like, I think we probably all say, yeah, in this scenario, we recognize that source reduction is not an option, food for people is not an option, for animals not an option, composting is not an option. Would it be helpful to throw some of those out or try to come to some consensus on that, or is that just kind of?
Well, I think implicit in this is if you don't generate something consumed by humans, you can't send into the charitable food system. So you don't have to do each of these things. You have to do the thing that is the highest on the list for what is appropriate to your material. You can't, if you have only rotting food, you can't, nobody can expect you to send it into the charitable food system.
We're into compost sometimes, right, as well. Depending.
Yeah, without getting into specifics, I guess the point is
Yeah.
it's just it's highest and best use. It doesn't mean that you always start it. That's not possible.
So we have about, what, 15 more minutes, and I, just as a point in time, maybe, I actually think it is productive. I think Jenna's question was, Jenna, there's not any dumb questions here. I just want to be clear, like, a lot of us struggling with this stuff, and a lot of us have spent a lot more time than maybe everybody on the committee has with this topic and this struggle. So feel free to ask these questions and have this dialogue. I actually think it's productive to where the group is directed to go. Further, do you want to take up this topic next time to start getting into it a bit? I don't know if that's the feelings of the group, but it seems like there's some productive discussion about where it is, yeah, I'm just trying to think about time and setting next meeting's agenda and seeing what can be fruitful.
Which is next week. by the
Next
way.
week, yeah.
So it's a short turnaround for this next meeting.
What day is that, Ben?
Wednesday the 5th.
Okay, thank you.
Same time, same place.
I mean, from my perspective, I absolutely think there's going to have to be exemptions because the types generators are so vastly different in how and why they're producing food waste. So I think it would be a good subject for the next call or the next meeting.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that, Jenna, as well, because I think the hard part for me is if we put this into like law, like how do then I get an exemption? Like what's the process to get that exemption? What's that look like so that we're doing the right thing and we could overwhelm some of the systems? I mean, we get requests all the time of material, just as an example, contaminated salmonella lettuce, right? Like, do we have to get an exemption every time, an approval from the state to say, hey, this needs to go to the landfill? Or
I think that those are actually non-issues, honestly, because I think that that's what's provided in the law. It's you cannot send contaminated food for human consumption. So nobody is already, like, just to be clear, this is in statute already. We're not talking about something that is theoretical. We have a law. A lot of people were involved in crafting that law. Now the question is just what, should it apply in all scenarios? And I think just the question is like, ultimately, like, is there a rubric? So if it's impossible, I don't think it's asking you to do that. I think it's a question of to what degree, if you have a kid that is a picky eater and they scrape their edible carrot sticks into the compost, is the state going to come down on you because there was edible carrot sticks in the compost and food rescue is higher on the hierarchy? That's where the de minimis. Right. We have these triggers already.
I think the bigger question is, do you guys want to talk about this the next meeting? Is
I
it
think
worth
there's
focusing
value
on
in
that?
hearing from some other stakeholders as well. To your point, like not every one of us understands all of this, right? So if we hear from some stakeholders on maybe their thoughts on exemptions, I think that would be valuable.
So maybe Matt Chapman could come in.
On the legal
We
side,
can invite Matt to give that,
I
and
can ask
Peter would be somebody who could maybe
Yep.
speak to some of that.
He's not, he's a
not-
division director now.
right, he's no longer at that level of lawyer, so I'll have to ask him what his thoughts are, whether it's qualified.
Yeah, he's been in the trenches on it. That would be great because
I don't think he would be opposed to participating if it works for his schedule, but he might say, I'm not with my lawyer hat.
I was just flagging that. I don't know if you knew he was the director now.
I didn't think.
We also have a question from Natasha. She's got her hand up. That's a good time to take that now.
Yeah, thanks. It's just a procedural question in terms of inviting folks in and just wondering, I mean, I have a short list that I would like to just submit, but I don't know if, like, is the group of stakeholders going to decide who comes in, or is it based on who is available? And in terms of taking it question by question, I mean, I think to some extent, from my point of view, that makes sense, but there also has to be the reality of people's availability and schedule. And if you say, hey, we're talking about this topic next week, can you come in? if someone's not available, does that mean this group doesn't get to hear from them, or is there some flexibility around that? And so I guess right now it's just more of a procedural question for to the group as a public participant in this meeting.
Thanks, Natasha. And so it is, in my interpretation of statute, is that this group decides who you hear from. And as we've said from the outset, no problems letting other stakeholders in and talk as long as you guys can have a productive dialogue. And that's been happening really well. But it is a thing you have to get out ahead of. So right now on the list, I have Matt Chapman and Peter Blair. And Peter's been joining us regularly. Thank you. So he hopefully can make next week. Mike, you talked about some other states. We can do some data digging to find out some stuff, and maybe we can, I don't know who in Colorado, if it's Colorado specifically, or maybe it's a New York DEC person.
Well, just to speak to the Colorado thing real quickly, that was mostly, I think, contamination concerns due to front of house restaurants, cafeterias, problems with source separation and compostable products being problematic, and so kind of applicable, but maybe tangential. But I don't know how they would speak. You can find somebody to speak to that aspect, but.
Yeah. And then I just, so to complete my thought, I heard from Aaron on other stakeholders that have a hierarchy impact or interest. I don't know if I'm saying that right, if there's lots of people you want.
I mean, looking at the, those others who are on the call, I would assume that there are other stakeholders that may have a desire to have a conversation or present to this committee. I don't have anyone top of mind, but just looking at the number of people on the call, I would assume that there's interest.
I do think Natasha's point is a valid one of everyone's got suggestions of who should speak to the group. And I think the group is probably charged with sifting through that and determining who you want to hear from. And we're happy to set that up. And as I mentioned, I think an email to everybody, we set those up as just sort of, in between meeting Teams things. If it's just one speaker for a half hour, that's more amenable to schedules to squeeze in a little bit of progress in between meetings. We can do that. That might make for more flexibility in the speaker schedules, and we're not beholden to the actual meeting dates. Just a suggestion.
And any of those could be recorded as are these meetings and available at any time.
Yep. You just missed the opportunity to ask questions.
And maybe even having a structured group that we come up with questions as a group that we'd want to ask. It's the same kind of questions to every individual of. So, I mean, there obviously might be some other questions for a certain specialty or expertise, but have the same laundry list of questions.
I was thinking
and also to help identify who we want to hear from, who we need to answer those questions.
It would be really helpful for the speaker, and I think the group will get more out of it if you could say, we'd like to have you in to talk about this specific 3 things. You know what I mean? Like, this is what we're struggling with. Can you just talk about this stuff so it doesn't get off the rails? You might get more out of it that way. So, but that takes more prep ahead of time too. So
yeah, this is sort of why I was suggesting we jump to 5 and then backfill with whatever time we have left on the other things. I mean, I think we're going to be short on time. We don't have time in our meetings. I don't think we want to spend time in our meetings coming up with laundry lists. So I wonder in the remaining 10 minutes whether we want to focus on creating a process and a structure for ourselves that we can then collect those questions and collect those individuals we want to hear from and begin sort of formalizing that list. And then if somebody like Natasha has a suggestion that can come in through A&R, get shared with the group, we can consider it and incorporate it if we think it's appropriate.
I'm in favor of structure. I'm also, I think, in favor of as much as I fear it, a separate meeting potentially for online only, shorter duration, that like having some flexibility both for whoever we're asking to speak, I think is going to be, like, we had a couple of those lined up and they were maybe non-specific, they could be on either of the topics, any of the topics, and just have a set designated time set aside open to everyone, but separate perhaps from the 2-hour meeting. I mean, or in addition to, maybe, I think in addition to rather than separate from the 2-hour meeting, just fearing that we're not going to get through it all.
What do others think? Because the only thing I worry about is how long it takes you all to decide on the people. And who the people, and there might be a really big list from other people, which just takes time, you know?
And secondarily to that, I think one thing is oftentimes getting decisions made through the email chain doesn't seem like.
Right.
So maybe if we kind of commit to like, okay, if the question posed, we'll respond within one business day, two business, some sort of reasonable timeline so we can keep decisions being made.
I will also say that if somebody is invited to the meeting and joins remotely or in person, and then you want to recognize them, and you all agree to I have no problem. I don't think there's any problem with that, and that can be more organic and timely. The problem is if that wastes somebody's time and they're sitting in the wings and you guys get into a really fruitful discussion and they don't get any time, that may be the only hazard to that.
I think I'd be in favor of designated times, either within the pre-scheduled meetings or separate meetings, and also like limiting. I mean, if Tom has an Excel sheet and other people have other lists, we're not gonna be able to hear from everyone on those lists. So how do we make those determinations, and probably how do we limit the amount of time to whoever we do designate, and make sure that everybody's getting their voices heard? So I feel like we should figure out a lot in the next 4 minutes.
Well, so far you've got, next topic is food hierarchy, unless somebody tells me that's wildly off base. And at least part of the agenda would be that. Maybe there's room for other stuff as well. And that some speakers, and we've got, as I said, Peter Blair, Matt Chapman, if he's available. Aaron, you sort of spoke that there's other stakeholders already up here that could represent their opinions on or experience with the hierarchy. We can get some more data from other states, at least to have as a reference data point on what states are doing with their hierarchies or what we know of it. You got top 3 from Natasha and Tom, or suggestions, or top 1 or 2 you want to throw out now for the group? And I'm just doing this to further the dialogue, to see in sense of time to get us further down the path.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong to do that. I feel like without sort of getting ahead of ourselves, though, it's a little hard before we kind of have a shared idea of what it is that we're trying to capture. I wonder if well, I'm going to promote, just to move it ahead, I'm going to throw something out to the A&R folks to think about for 1 second and then propose something to the group. So I think what would be useful specifically with the hierarchy in mind is to hear from you all about some of the challenges and questions you've been bumping up against that would be helpful to see get addressed through this process, because you guys have been thinking about it.
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, so if there's pertinent to that might help us zero in on some of that. I think just going forward, if we could agree to submit questions and suggestions for people to answer some of those questions by Friday this week, and we could kind of begin to narrow down, like, okay, we're going to want to hear from a total of 12 people over 4 meetings. That's 3 people a meeting. We got to start narrowing down that list. Who sort of gives us the most opportunity to learn something based on our, what are our priority questions?
Questions relating to all 3 of the questions from the legislature.
I think the way I've started personally organizing, and I was trying to lead us through it, but we were a little tight on time, obviously, is just thinking about the legislative question and then the questions that are required to answer the legislative question. And then for me, it's been who can help us answer those questions. And to that end, whether that's something A&R staff can offer support with, of just being the recipient of input and aggregating it in one place for everybody to be able to see.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at Friday as the deadline, we can turn something around on Monday and just say, here's the aggregated list, and then decisions on who you want to invite. That seem reasonable?
Yep. I think the only question, we have a raised hand from Peter, but just before I go to Peter, and you said who we need to hear from to answer those questions. So are people also submitting suggested speakers
Yeah,
out by Friday?
yeah, I think so. And I think it's fair to, if you don't know who the right person is, but you know, sort of, I want somebody from the grocery industry to speak about it or whatever, like, I think it's okay to sort of identify.
Okay. Jenna, did that come through? Did you hear that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, somebody is not on mute and I'm getting a lot of static and can't hear very well, so.
Okay, I think it's coming through. And Natasha, thanks for muting Natasha. So Jenna, what Tom was just saying was that by Friday, submit questions. Basically, what questions do you think you need answered in order to answer the 3 legislative charge questions? You know, like what does it bring up for you that you could use some help with? And then second, who do you need to hear from to inform, you know, any sort of recommendations along those lines? And if you don't know the who, the Jane Doe, the John Does of the world, just say like Tom said, you know, a representative from the supermarket industry, or I don't know, whatever, we can go, you know, we can go from there. Did that come through, Jenna?
Finding all of these notes, is this, or is it going, are we emailing somebody about our thoughts, or how is this being combined?
Yeah, you could email the agency those questions. Ben, would you mind taking that? So email Ben Gothier your questions and your people you want to hear from by Friday. Is that clear for everybody? Am I making it more confusing?
Sounds clear to me.
And then Peter, go ahead. Sorry.
I actually think I'm good. I was going to say that there was a little static coming in, so the people on the Teams call couldn't hear, but you answered all my questions. I just want a clarification on kind of what Tom was saying about the next steps in terms of questions and speakers. So I'm all set.
Okay, thank you.
I would add one more column too that I think we could do so that we also are efficient with our time. Where we think something exists, be it data or a report, if we A&R has already offered to go gather those things for us. So instead of trying to track somebody down who can specifically speak to it, if there's a said EPA report, let's just make sure that gets gotten and put in the shared folder. So I think a data and information
Pardon me.
list in addition to the speaker testimony part.
I think what we should do is email you all with this instructions, and I will ask Ben to send it, and then it will come back to him. So you'll get an email from Ben asking these framing questions, and then you'll know to respond back to him. And that way, you don't have to scribble your notes down on what we said here. It'll be, is that okay,
Yeah.
Ben? To put you on the spot.
Clarify that email's going to the 7, not the
Yeah, the 7.
100.
I think if again, we have this balance juggling act with the public stakeholders, but yeah, but that's who the email's going to right now.
So would it be fair to request that any of those 100, if they had burning things that they wanted submitted, that they would go through one of the 7 or directly through A&R?
Yeah.
Well, through one of the 7, I guess, not through A&R.
People have been emailing us. I know.
Yeah,
Maria's
it's gonna
gotten
be, I
some-
mean, yeah, I just can't imagine if it goes through one of you. If you all miss the email, it just gets too complicated.
Yeah. So if, just to clarify on that
Yeah.
point, any stakeholders listening in, if you want to submit any thoughts you have along these lines, you can send them to Ben or Mia. And we can share those back with the group.
And then I guess, are we wanting, like we have sort of 2 people coming in potentially at the next meeting. I don't think we have a sort of a time tolerance for more than 3 or maybe 4 people at a shot. Are we wanting to generate 3?
I do also want to base, I mean, I know comments earlier about some flexibility with the hierarchy and then Dan, I think you mentioned exemptions. I mean, I think there may be, I think I'm going to have some questions that people in this room can answer.
Mhm.
And so I just want to like, make sure we have a space in there so that we don't always have to bring in experts. And if that people around this table can speak to some of these questions, like, you know, what is the process for designating one of the people at this table a speaker per se, and giving those individuals the time to share some of their perspective, because I think a number of us around the table have those perspectives on the hierarchy and are aware of some of the challenges. So just making sure we have those opportunities. So.
Agreed, Steve. And so what I have so far is a rough agenda, which is going to be added to as you guys inform it with your Friday submittals, but hear from the agency about the hierarchy and our thoughts and experience with it. We've invited 2 speakers so far, at least to be there, Matt and Peter Blair, for the agency to come back with any info it's found on other states and how they're balancing their hierarchies. And then the main topic, which is the hierarchy discussion. And I think that even the speakers that you invite will chime in on that, as well as people who are here remotely and in person. I see that as being probably an organic conversation.
I mean, I'm not certain, but I think like Mike, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the hierarchy. And then Dan, I think you as well. Jenna, I don't know how much in the space you do, and Tom. But I mean, I think I would benefit from the knowledge in this room. The rest of the group thinks it's appropriate, so.
Do we designate like after we hear from the agency first on next Wednesday that we set aside 15, 20 minutes and hear from all the 7 who have something to share on that? Well, I think that'd be a great model, actually, maybe as we work forward with the other ones, that we go from what knowledge that we have easily accessible first, and then bring in outside, easy to get to information from others, and then, you know, get to the easy stuff first.
We can do
Try to
that.
bring us up to the same base level of knowledge and understanding.
We have done that in other stakeholder groups. We just go around and you guys can go around as the first go around.
So long as it's not like an hour of that, you know, that can happen too. But Pat Austin's not in the group, so I think. I deal with them every day.
All right, I think we have, I think we have a rough plan. We can put a draft agenda together. We can have an email come out from Ben to you all and get your feedback, and then start putting that agenda, getting your approval on it for the next week.
I have one thing. I know we're 5 minutes over, but I am concerned about this existing timing of our scheduled meetings, and that basically we have a meeting next week without a whole lot of time to prepare and call people in and whatnot. And then it's like a whole nother month. We don't have another October meeting, and then it's 2 in November, which includes a holiday as a month. And then we have 2 for December, which in my life experience is a terrible time to try to do meetings and then turn a report up. So I would love for us to, even if we can't find a date right now, kind of commit to, or consider committing to an additional October meeting.
Isn't there one on October 26th?
All we have scheduled so far is October 5th, November 9th, and November 30th. And I'm happy to send out another poll. Fridays could be included. That wasn't included on that first round. And that might give you all more options.
Or maybe a Zoom only meeting for some of those in between meetings. I mean, Teams only.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it easier. I think I'm in agreement that that's a long time to go, like hurried, and then a long time to wait for more information and remembering where we left off. Be good to keep that momentum with another October something.
Maybe we'll try for another meeting in October, see if it aligns with all your schedules and your availability.
Awesome.
It'll be remote, right?
It could be either. This meeting you could come to, I mean, in my opinion, it's up to you. I think there's fruitful dialogue when you're in person, but if you decide you want to just, for the sake of time, be remote, do it, you know, at your preference.
Yeah, I'll send that out today.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, everybody, for joining remotely and talk to you next time.